The betrayal. I never thought I'd find myself sitting alone in a darkened cafe, staring into the void of my own reflection in a rain-speckled window. The coffee in front of me had gone cold, untouched, its bitterness leaching into the air like an unspoken truth. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Cars splashing through puddles, people moving briskly beneath umbrellas, and the distant hum of a life I suddenly felt alienated from. This was the place we used to come to, my wife and I. The memory hit me hard, a sucker punch to the chest, as I remembered her laughter echoing over the clinking of porcelain cups. Her hair, dark as spilled ink, would fall over one shoulder as she leaned in to tell me something conspiratorial. Usually trivial, but it always felt like a secret shared just between us. That memory now felt as distant as a dream, dissipating in the harsh light of waking reality. It had started 2 weeks ago with something as small and insidious as a whisper. A late-night text message. The glow of her phone had cast an eerie light on her face as she lay beside me in bed. She'd smiled, a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months, and quickly flipped the screen face down. Who could it be at this hour? I'd wondered, brushing it off with a forced nonchalance. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew rapidly, fueled by every subtle change in her behavior. The hurried whispers on the phone, the sudden excuses to step out, the scent of unfamiliar. Cologne lingering on her clothes. I tried to confront her once. "Is everything okay?" I'd asked. My voice steady but laced with an undertone I knew she'd catch. She'd looked at me with those dark, unreadable eyes, her expression carefully neutral. Of course. Why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't it be? The words echoed, in my head like a taunt even now. The cafe door jingled open, snapping me out of my thoughts. I looked up instinctively, half expecting it to be her, walking in with that effortless grace that used to make my heart race. Instead, it was just a man with a worn trench coat, shaking the rain off his umbrella. I let out a breath I hadn't, realized I was holding. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the crumpled receipt that had led me here. The receipt was from a boutique hotel downtown, dated last Friday. It wasn't mine. The discovery had been accidental, or maybe not. I'd been searching for my phone charger in the car's glove compartment when my fingers brushed against the slick paper. As soon as I read the name of the hotel, my stomach dropped. It was the kind of place that didn't advertise itself with neon signs, the kind of place that promised discretion. I had spent the weekend spiraling, the receipt burning a hole in my pocket, while I played the role of the unsuspecting husband. She'd been out, of course, claiming she had to stay late, at work, and I'd stayed home, stewing in my thoughts, my mind a battlefield of anger, doubt, and an insidious sense of betrayal. Now, sitting here in this cafe, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know the truth. I glanced at the small notebook I'd brought along. In it were notes, names, dates, fragments of conversations I'd overheard, details I'd pieced together like a detective working a case too close to home. The question wasn't if she was betraying me, it was why. I tucked the notebook back into my jacket and left the cafe, stepping into the rain-soaked streets. The chill of the evening settled into my bones, but I barely noticed. My mind was too preoccupied, running through the fragmented puzzle pieces I'd collected. The boutique hotel was only a few blocks away. I hadn't planned to go there tonight, but my feet moved of their own accord, carrying me closer with every step. My heart beat faster as I approached, a dull thud in my chest that matched the rhythm of the rain. When I reached the hotel, its modest facade loomed over me like a silent accusation. A brass sign next to the entrance read, "The Hawthorne." The lights inside were warm and inviting, spilling out onto the slick pavement, but I felt no comfort as I stood there staring at the revolving doors. "What are you hoping to find?" I asked myself, but there was no answer. I hesitated before stepping inside. The lobby was quiet, almost unnervingly so. A young woman sat behind the front desk, her eyes flicking up briefly as I entered. She was in her mid-20s, with perfectly styled hair and an expression that hovered somewhere between polite disinterest and professional detachment. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but practiced. I nodded but didn't respond immediately. My eyes wandered, taking in the elegant furnishings, the marble floor, the soft glow of chandeliers overhead. It all felt surreal, like I was stepping into a world I didn't belong to. "Can I help you with something?" the receptionist prompted, her gaze sharpening slightly. I approached the desk, forcing a polite smile. "I was wondering, I think my wife might have stayed here recently. I found a receipt, but I just wanted to confirm. Could you check for me?" Her expression barely flickered, but I caught the slight tightening of her mouth. "I'm sorry, sir. For privacy reasons, I can't share guest information." "Of course," I said quickly, trying to keep my tone light. "I understand. Well, if I could describe her, maybe, or give you her name. I'm not asking for much, just confirmation." Her hesitation was telling. She looked as though she was weighing whether to push back or make an exception. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "Please, it's important." The seconds stretched painfully, but finally, she sighed. "What's the name?" "Rebecca Hart." The words tasted bitter in my mouth. She turned to her computer, her fingers moving deftly across the keyboard. I watched her closely, searching for any sign of recognition. When she finally stopped typing, her face was unreadable. "I'm sorry, sir," she said after a moment, her tone brisk. "I can't give you any information." That was confirmation enough. I nodded, murmuring a strained thank you, and turned to leave. My hands were trembling as I stepped outside, the rain hitting my face like needles. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It wasn't paranoia or overthinking. She had been here. I spent the next hour walking aimlessly through the city, my mind a whirlwind of questions. Why here? Why now? Who was she meeting? Each one hit me like a fresh wound, but the answers seemed farther away than ever. When I finally got home, the apartment was dark, except for the soft glow of the living room lamp. Rebecca was there, curled up on the couch, her laptop balanced, on her knees. She looked up as I entered, her face lighting up with a smile that felt both familiar and foreign. "You're late," she said, her voice warm. The sight of her, so effortless in her composure, made my chest tighten. How could she look so calm, so innocent? "Yeah," I said, shrugging out of my jacket. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. Lost track of time. I walked to the kitchen, needing a moment to collect myself. The sound of her typing resumed, filling the silence like a metronome. Should I confront her now? The thought clawed at me, but I hesitated. Something told me the truth wouldn't come so easily. Instead, I reached for a glass of water, my hands gripping the counter as I stared blankly at the sink. My reflection in the window above it stared back at me, eyes heavy with doubt and something else, something darker. Tomorrow, I decided, my jaw tightening. Tomorrow, I'll find out everything. And with that, I turned off the light, stepping back into the living room where Rebecca waited, the air between us thick with the weight of unspoken words. The following morning arrived with a heaviness I couldn't shake. The pale winter light filtered through the blinds, casting faint stripes across the bed where Rebecca still slept. I sat on the edge of the mattress, fully dressed, staring at her as if she were a stranger. Her face, serene in sleep, was the same one I had loved for years, the slight curve of her lips, the gentle rise and fall of her breath. But now, every feature seemed unfamiliar, cloaked in the shadows of my doubts. I left quietly, the click of the door a punctuation mark on my decision. The private investigator's office was exactly what I expected, dimly lit, with blinds half drawn, and a lingering scent of stale coffee. A man sat behind a cluttered desk, his sharp eyes peering at me over thin wire-rimmed glasses. His name was Daniel Green, a no-nonsense type with graying hair and a presence that exuded competence. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked after I laid out the situation. I nodded, my hands gripping the arms of the chair. "I need the truth." He leaned back, studying me for a moment. "It'll take a few days to get anything concrete. Could be nothing, you know." "Or it could be everything," I replied, my voice flat. Green didn't argue. He slid a form across the desk for me to sign, then assured me he'd start immediately. As I left his office, a knot of anxiety tightened in my chest, but beneath it was something else, a grim determination. The days that followed were a blur of routine, each moment charged with the weight of what I didn't know. Rebecca was the same, warm, attentive, her usual self. It almost made me doubt everything. Almost. Then the call came. "Got something," Green said, his voice clipped. "You might want to sit down for this." I barely heard him. My grip on the phone tightened as he spoke, the details sinking into me like cold steel. A man, late 40s, regular meetings at the Hawthorne. Their last rendezvous had been 2 nights ago, the same night Rebecca had told me she was working late. I didn't respond right away. My thoughts swirled, a chaotic storm of anger, pain, and something darker. Betrayal, raw and unforgiving. "Want me to dig deeper?" Green asked, his tone carefully neutral. "No," I said, my voice like gravel. "I know enough." That evening, I returned home early. Rebecca was in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables. The scent of garlic and rosemary filled the air, a reminder of the life we'd built together, a life that now felt like an illusion. "Hey," she said, glancing over her shoulder with a smile. "You're home early?" I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, watching her. My heart ached at the sight of her so effortlessly happy, so blissfully unaware of the storm brewing within me. "Rebecca," I said finally, my voice low but steady. She paused, sensing the shift in my tone. Slowly, she turned to face me, the knife still in her hand. "What's wrong?" I took a step closer, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on me. "We need to talk." Her brow furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. "About what?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. But there was no turning back now. "About the Hawthorne." The knife slipped from her fingers, clattering against the cutting board. Her face paled, and for a moment she was frozen, like a deer caught in headlights. "I don't," she began, but I cut her off. "Don't lie to me, Rebecca. I know." Her lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "Who is he?" I demanded, my voice rising despite myself. She took a step back, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, guilt, or maybe both. "It's not what you think," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Then tell me," I shot back. "Tell me what it is, because right now, all I see is you sneaking around behind my back, meeting some guy at a hotel." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "It's complicated." The words hit me like a slap. My chest tightened, anger flaring hot and wild. "Complicated? You're my wife, Rebecca. It's supposed to be simple." She opened, her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. "I trusted you," I said, my voice breaking. "Was any of it real?" The tears spilled over, tracing silent paths down her cheeks. "Of course it was," she whispered. "It still is, but her words felt hollow, lost in the chasm that had opened between us. Rebecca stood there, tears streaming down her face, but the words I needed to hear didn't come. Her silence felt like an admission, the final nail in the coffin of my trust. "You owe me the truth," I said, my voice sharp and unwavering. "No more games. No more half-answers. If there's anything left between us, anything real, you'll tell me what's going on." She hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the counter. I could see the internal war playing out behind her eyes, a mix of shame, fear, and something I couldn't quite name. Finally, she exhaled, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her secrets had finally become too much to bear. "It's not what you think," she said again, quieter this time. I crossed my arms, my expression hard. "Then what is it, Rebecca? Enlighten me." She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Michael. He's someone from my past." The name struck me like a physical blow. Michael, a man I'd never heard of, yet whose presence had now upended my life. "And," I pressed, my tone razor sharp, "what does this Michael have to do with sneaking off to hotels?" Her gaze dropped to the floor, her voice trembling. "We were engaged. Before you." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, the ground shifting beneath me. "Engaged?" I repeated, the word foreign and jagged in my mouth. She nodded, her face a mask of pain. "It was years ago. We ended things, badly. But recently he reached out. He wanted to meet, to talk." I felt a surge of anger, hot and uncontrollable. "And you thought it was a good idea to meet him in secret? At a hotel, of all places?" Her head snapped up, and for the first time I saw a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "I didn't tell you because I knew how you'd react," she said, her voice steadier now. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt me?" I scoffed, the bitterness in my voice surprising even me. "Rebecca, do you have any idea what this has done to me? The lies, the secrecy. How could you think that wouldn't hurt me?" She flinched, the defiance fading as quickly as it had come. "I wasn't trying to hide an affair," she said, softly. I needed closure. For myself. For everything that happened with him." The words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the idea that this was all just a misunderstanding. But the other part, the part that had spent sleepless nights piecing together her betrayal, wasn't so easily convinced. "Why a hotel?" I asked finally, my voice quieter but no less intense. "If this was just about talking, why not meet? Somewhere. Normal?" She hesitated again, and the silence stretched like a taut wire. "Because he's married," she said at last, her voice barely audible. The revelation hit me like a freight train. The pieces began to fall into place, painting a picture I wasn't sure I wanted to see. "I didn't want anyone to know," she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Not his wife. Not you. No one. It was selfish, I know. But I needed to face him, to confront what happened between us, so I could move on, with you." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she looked at me with an expression that was equal parts pleading and broken. But I couldn't meet her gaze. My mind was racing, grappling with everything she'd just revealed. Was this the truth? Or just another carefully constructed lie? "I don't know if I can believe you," I said finally, my voice hollow. Rebecca took a tentative step toward me, her hand reaching out, but I pulled back. The distance between us felt insurmountable, a chasm carved by secrets and betrayal. "I need time," I said, my tone resolute, "to figure out what I believe, and whether I can forgive this." She didn't protest, didn't beg. She simply nodded, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. I understand, she whispered. But as I turned and walked away, leaving her standing, there in the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than either of us could have imagined. Rebecca's perspective. I stood in the kitchen, the knife forgotten on the counter, my hands trembling as I watched him walk away. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, and with it, a silence so profound it felt alive. I sank into a chair, my legs unable to hold me any longer. Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't bother wiping them away. What was the point? There was no hiding my guilt now, not from him, not from myself. I'd hurt him in ways I never intended, ways I didn't fully understand until I saw the pain etched into his face. And now the fragile life we'd built together was unraveling, thread by thread, because of me. It had started innocently, or so I told myself at the time. Michael's name had appeared in my inbox one morning, a ghost from a past I'd spent years trying to bury. Rebecca, the email read, I know it's been a long time, but I've been thinking about you. There's so much I never got to say. If you're open to it, I'd like to talk. Just once. I should have ignored it, deleted it, blocked him. But I didn't. I sat there for hours, staring at the screen, my coffee growing cold beside me. Memories of Michael surfaced unbidden, his laugh, his touch, the way he'd made me feel invincible, until the day he didn't. We'd fallen apart spectacularly, our engagement ending. In a storm of accusations and tears, he'd broken me in ways I hadn't even realized until much later. But time had dulled the edges of those wounds, leaving behind a curiosity I couldn't ignore. What could he possibly want now? The question gnawed at me, and against my better judgment, I responded. A simple, cautious reply. What is it you think we need to talk about? Our first meeting was in a coffee shop across town, far from the places I usually frequented. I told myself it was harmless, just a conversation, closure maybe, but the moment I saw him, all the rationalizations crumbled. Michael hadn't changed, much, still tall, still carrying himself with the same quiet confidence that had once drawn me to him like a moth to a flame. His smile was hesitant, as though he wasn't sure how I'd react, but his eyes, they held a weight I couldn't ignore. Rebecca, he said, his voice softer than I remembered. Thank you for meeting me. I nodded, my throat tight. You said you had things to say. He told me about his life since we'd parted, his career, his marriage, his regrets, and then, slowly, carefully, he started to talk about us. About the mistakes he'd made, the things he wished he could take back. It should have felt satisfying, hearing him admit to the ways he'd hurt me. But instead, it stirred up emotions I thought I'd buried. Anger, sadness, longing. When we parted, he asked if we could meet again. There's still so much I want to say, he said. I hesitated, but in the end I agreed. The meetings became a secret I carried like a stone in my chest. Each time I told myself it would be the last. And each time I found myself saying yes. Again, not because I loved him, not anymore, but because I was chasing something I couldn't quite name. Closure? Redemption? The chance to rewrite the ending of a chapter I'd never truly finished? I didn't tell my husband because I didn't want to hurt him. But deep down, I knew that was only part of the truth. I also didn't want to admit to him or to myself that I'd let Michael back into my life, even in this limited way. Then came the night at the Hawthorne. Michael had asked me to meet him there, claiming it was more private than our usual spots. I'd agreed, though I hated the idea of being somewhere so intimate. We didn't touch. We didn't even sit close to each other. But the weight of what we were doing hung over us, unspoken but palpable. That was the last time I saw him. I told him it had to end, that I couldn't keep sneaking around like this. He understood. Or at least he said he did. But the damage was already done. Now, sitting alone in the kitchen, I replayed every decision, every lie, every moment that had brought us to this breaking point. I didn't love Michael. I knew that much, but I'd let him pull me back into his orbit, let my unresolved feelings cloud my judgment. And in doing so, I'd betrayed the one person who had always been there for me, who had given me the life Michael never could. I buried my face in my hands, the tears coming harder now. How could I have been so blind, so selfish, and yet a small, stubborn part of me whispered that it wasn't all my fault, that I had been searching for something Michael represented, a piece of myself I'd lost long ago, but that didn't make it right. Had to fix this, somehow. But I didn't know if my husband would ever let me. Would he see my actions for what they were, a mistake, born of weakness and unresolved pain? Or would he only see the betrayal, the lies? I didn't know. And that uncertainty was the most terrifying thing of all. Husband's perspective. The air outside was bitterly cold, but I barely noticed it. I walked without direction, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, my breath clouding the night air. Her words echoed in my head, a disjointed symphony of confession and justification. I needed closure. He's married. It wasn't what you think. The betrayal burned in my chest, a relentless ache that refused to be soothed. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But how could I? The secrecy, the hotel, the lies, they painted a picture that words alone couldn't undo. I found myself at the park near our house, the playground empty in the dead of winter. The swings swayed slightly in the wind, their creaking chains breaking the silence. I sat on a bench, my head in my hands, and let the night engulf me. What was I supposed to do now? Rebecca had been my anchor, my partner, the person I trusted above all else. We'd built a life together, a home, a history. And yet here, I was questioning everything. Had I been blind, too complacent? Had I missed the signs that something was wrong? I thought back to the little moments that now seemed so glaring in hindsight. The late-night phone calls she dismissed as work, the way she'd grown distant, the moments when her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Was this my fault? The thought hit me like a sucker punch. I'd been so wrapped up in my own routines, my own stresses, that I hadn't noticed her slipping away. Maybe if I'd paid more attention, been more present, this wouldn't have happened. But another part of me rebelled against that idea. No, this wasn't on me. Relationships had cracks. Everyone had cracks. But it was how you handled them that mattered. And Rebecca, she'd chosen to handle them by turning to him. I leaned back on the bench, staring up at the stars. They were indifferent, cold and distant, so far removed from the chaos of human lives. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Our wedding day. The way she'd looked at me as we said our vows, her eyes shining with love and promise. "I will always choose you," she'd said, her voice steady and certain. Where had that gone? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos, my thumb pausing on one of the two of us at the beach. She was laughing, her hair wild in the wind, her hand in mine. We'd been so happy then, so whole. When I finally walked back to the house, the lights were still on. I hesitated at the door, my hand resting on the cold metal of the doorknob. Part of me wanted to leave, to walk away and let her feel the weight of what she'd done. But another part, the part that still loved her, despite everything, wanted answers. I stepped inside. The kitchen was empty, but I could hear her in the living room, the soft murmur of her sobs cutting through. The silence. I stood there for a moment, watching her from the doorway. She was curled up on the couch, her face buried in a throw pillow, her body trembling with every breath. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something, pity, maybe, or compassion. But It was quickly drowned out by the anger still smoldering in my chest. I cleared my throat and she looked up, her tear-streaked face pale and drawn. "You're back," she said, her voice small and hesitant. I nodded, stepping into the room but keeping my distance. I needed to think. She sat up, clutching, the pillow like a shield. "And?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "And I still don't know what to believe. You say it wasn't an affair, but Rebecca, you lied to me, repeatedly. How am I supposed to trust you now?" Her lips trembled, and she looked down at her hands. "I don't expect you to trust me. Not right away. But I'll do whatever it takes to prove myself to you." The vulnerability in her voice tugged at something deep inside me, but I forced myself to stay firm. "Why didn't you tell me about him in the first place? About Michael?" She hesitated, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind, searching for the right words. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said finally. "And I didn't want to face what his reappearance meant for me, for us. I thought I could handle it on my own." "And look where that got us," I said bitterly. She flinched, and I felt a pang of guilt, but I didn't take the words back. "Do you love him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "No, I don't love him. I haven't loved him for years." "Then why?" Her gaze dropped again, her hands twisting in her lap. Because he was a part of me I never fully let go of, and I needed to confront that part, to understand it. But it was never about love or wanting him back. I swear to you it wasn't." Her words hung in the air, raw and uncertain. I wanted to believe her. But could I? I stood there for a long moment, my thoughts a tangled mess. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let the anger and betrayal consume me. Rebecca's perspective. The emptiness in the house after he went upstairs was unbearable. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside felt like an accusation. I stayed on the couch for hours, staring at the darkened television screen. My reflection looked like a stranger. Eyes swollen, hair a mess, lips trembling with words I couldn't bring myself to say. He'd said he needed time, that I could give him. But what? Did that mean for me? Sitting and waiting, hoping he'd decide I was worth another chance? That wasn't enough. If I wanted to save our marriage, I had to act. The first thing I did was write Michael an email. I hesitated before hitting send, my finger hovering over the mouse. The words were stark and final. "Michael, I can't keep doing this. Whatever part of me thought I needed closure was wrong. The only thing I need is to focus on my marriage and repair the damage I've caused. Please don't contact me again." Rebecca, I hit send and immediately deleted his contact information from my phone. It felt symbolic in a way, a small step, toward closing the door I'd left open for far too long, but it wasn't enough. The damage had already been done, and no amount of distancing myself from Michael would erase the betrayal my husband felt. The next day, I made an appointment with a therapist. It felt strange, sitting in that quiet, sterile office, pouring out my guilt and confusion to a stranger. But the therapist listened patiently, nodding as I explained everything. How Michael had reappeared, how I'd let myself be drawn back into his orbit, and how it had spiraled into a secret that now threatened to destroy my marriage. "Why do you think you responded to Michael's email in the first place?" she asked, her pen poised over her notepad. I hesitated. "I don't know," I said at first, but the answer came tumbling out before I could stop it. Maybe I felt like I'd lost something when I ended things with him. Not love, exactly, but a version of myself. With him, I was reckless and free and alive. And I've been so safe, so predictable for so long. I think I was chasing that part of me, not him." She nodded, her expression thoughtful, And now that you've had time to reflect, do you feel like that part of you is missing? Or is it something you've outgrown? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But it was a question worth exploring. At home, I started writing letters to my husband, ones I never intended to send. I poured everything into those pages, my guilt, my regret, my love for him. I wrote about the good times we'd shared, the little moments that made our life together feel sacred. I wrote about my fears, my insecurities, and the parts of myself I didn't fully understand. Some nights, I read those letters aloud to myself, imagining what it would be like to say the words to him. I also started paying attention to the little things I'd neglected, the things I'd taken for granted in our life together. I cleaned out the closet he'd been complaining about for months. I made his favorite meals even if he didn't touch them. I left sticky notes on the fridge with reminders of things I loved about him. You make the best coffee. The way you laugh when you're really happy, it's my favorite sound. They were small gestures, but they felt important. One evening, I found myself staring at the photo album we kept in the living room. It was full of snapshots from our life, holidays, vacations, lazy Sunday mornings. I ran my fingers over the images, tears streaming down my face. How did we get here? I thought. And how do I bring us back? I decided to show him the album. Maybe it was a way to remind him of what we'd built. Or maybe it was just a selfish attempt to hold on to something that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. When he came downstairs that night, his expression guarded, I handed him the album without a word. He hesitated before taking it, his eyes flicking from my face to the cover. Finally, he opened it, flipping through the pages in silence. I didn't say anything. I didn't push. I just sat beside him, hoping the memories would speak for themselves. Husband's perspective. The photo album sat on the coffee table for 2 days before I opened it again. She'd handed it to me that night, her face an open book of hope and hesitation. I wasn't ready then. I wasn't sure I'd ever be. But tonight, something compelled me to sit down and flip through its pages. The first photo was from our honeymoon, a blurry shot of us on a beach in Mexico. The camera had caught Rebecca mid-laugh, her face glowing with the kind of joy that seemed so effortless back then. I was beside her, grinning like an idiot, my arms slung around her shoulders. I ran my finger over the glossy surface, the memory, both sweet and bitter. We'd been so young, so certain of ourselves and our future. Where had that certainty gone? She'd been trying, I could see that. The notes on the fridge, the little changes around the house. It was all her way of saying, I'm still here. I still care. Part of me wanted to scoff at the gestures, to write them off as too little, too late. But another part, the part that still clung to the idea of us, couldn't help but soften. I remembered the way she'd looked that night on the couch, her face streaked with tears, her voice trembling as she said, I'll do whatever it takes. She meant it. But did I? The album was a portal to a life I wasn't sure we could get back to. As I turned the pages, I found myself smiling despite everything, at the picture of her covered in flour after our first attempt at making bread, at the shot of us bundled up on a snowy hike, our noses red from the cold. By the time I reached the last photo, a selfie we'd taken at a friend's wedding, her head resting on my shoulder, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks. Hope. That night, as we lay in bed, the silence between us felt less heavy. I looked at the album, I said finally, my voice breaking the stillness. Rebecca turned toward me, her eyes wide with surprise. You did? I nodded. It reminded me of us, the good parts, the parts I want to believe we can get back to. Her breath hitched, and she reached for my hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed against mine. I want that too, she whispered. I'll do anything to make that happen. I didn't pull away, but I didn't fully close the distance either. "It's going to take time," I said, "and I can't promise that I won't still be angry or that I won't question things, but I want to try." Her grip on my hand tightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a glimmer of relief in her eyes. In the days that followed, I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. I noticed how she'd begun to ask about my day again, her questions more than surface-level small talk. I saw her reading late into the night, the titles on her bedside table all about relationships and rebuilding trust. She didn't push me to talk, but she made it clear that she was ready to listen whenever I was. And slowly, I found myself opening. Up one night as we sat on the couch, I asked, "Why did you give me the album?" She looked up from the mug of tea cradled in her hands, her expression thoughtful. "Because I wanted you to remember the good parts of us," she said, "and because I needed to remind myself too." Her honesty caught me off guard. I nodded, staring down at my own hands. "We've lost some of those good parts," I said after a moment, "but maybe we can find new ones." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached for my hand again. This time I didn't hesitate. Husband's perspective. For all the hope the photo album had sparked, reality didn't bend easily to nostalgia. The small moments of connection, her hand on mine, her soft apologies, her efforts to reclaim a sense of normalcy, were always accompanied by the shadow of what she'd done. Some nights I would wake up to the sound of her breathing beside me, steady and even, and the anger would hit me like a storm. How could she sleep so peacefully while I'm drowning in this? I hated that thought. I hated the resentment that clawed at me when she wasn't looking. But it was there, and I didn't know how to silence it. One of the hardest parts was Michael, even though she'd shown me the email she'd sent cutting him off. "Please don't contact me again." It wasn't enough. His presence lingered, like smoke in a room, impossible to fully banish. I didn't know how often she thought of him, or if she did at all, and the not knowing drove me insane. One evening we were sitting at the dinner table in an uneasy quiet. She'd made my favorite, spaghetti, carbonara, but I wasn't hungry. My fork pushed noodles around my plate without purpose, the weight of the conversation I'd been avoiding pressing down on me. Finally, I put the fork down. "Do you miss him?" The question came out harsher than I intended, and her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "What? Do you miss him?" I repeated, my voice steadier but no less tense. Rebecca set her fork down carefully, her hands trembling. No, I don't." "Then why?" I asked, my voice rising. "Why let him back into your life? Why risk everything we had for someone you don't even miss?" Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I wasn't missing him. I was missing something in myself, and I thought he could fill that void." Her words were honest, and that made them worse. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You could have come to me," I said, my voice tight with anger. "You could have told me how you felt, but instead you went to him." "I know," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "And it was a mistake, a horrible mistake. But I'm here now, and I'm trying to fix it." The argument didn't end with an apology or resolution. It ended with me walking out the front door, needing air, needing space. The next challenge was trust. Even though she had no contact with Michael, I couldn't stop myself from imagining scenarios where she did. If her phone buzzed while we were sitting on the couch, my heart would seize, and I'd glance at the screen before I could stop myself. It didn't help that she noticed. "You're checking my phone again," she said one evening, her voice heavy with sadness. I didn't deny it. "Can you blame me?" "No," she admitted. "But it still hurts." We stared at each other across the room, the gap between us feeling like an ocean. "I don't know how to stop," I said, my voice quieter now. The doubt. It's always there. Then tell me what I can do, she pleaded. I'll do anything, but I can't erase your doubt for you. You have to want to let it go. Her words stayed with me long after she went to bed. Therapy became a battlefield. The couple's counselor was kind but firm, pushing us both to confront the things we'd been avoiding. Why didn't you tell him about Michael when he first reached out? The counselor asked Rebecca during one session. She hesitated, glancing at me before answering. I didn't want to hurt him. I thought I could handle it on my own, and it would just go away. And how did that work out for you? The counselor asked gently. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. It didn't. I hurt him even more. The counselor turned to me. And how do you feel hearing that? I crossed my arms, my jaw tight, angry, still angry, and confused. If she knew it would hurt me, why risk it in the first place? That's a valid question, the counselor said. Rebecca, how would you respond? I wasn't thinking clearly, she said softly. I was selfish, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Her honesty disarmed me, but it didn't erase the pain. The road ahead was steep, and I knew it wouldn't be a straight line. There were still moments when I'd lash out, unable to keep the anger in check. There were nights when Rebecca would cry herself to sleep, and I wouldn't know how to comfort her. But there were also moments of clarity, brief but powerful, when I'd catch a glimpse of the woman I fell in love with, and I'd think, maybe, just maybe, we'll make it through. This husband's perspective. The anger was a fire I couldn't put out. Every effort she made to repair what was broken felt like pouring water on a raging inferno, futile and frustrating. And when I wasn't angry, I was hollow. I couldn't escape. The image of her and Michael, the imagined conversations, the moments they shared behind my back, they haunted me. At night, I'd stare at the ceiling, my mind racing through scenarios that twisted my gut. She wanted forgiveness. But forgiveness felt like surrender, and surrender wasn't in me. Revenge wasn't a conscious decision. It was a slow, creeping temptation, a thought that started small but grew into something undeniable. She betrayed me. Why should she get to move on unscathed? I didn't have a plan, just an idea, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. It started subtly. I became colder, more distant. When she reached out to touch me, I'd pull away. When she asked how I was feeling, I'd shrug and mutter, fine, knowing full well I wasn't. I wanted her to feel the isolation I'd endured. Then came the flirting. It wasn't hard. I'd always been good with people, and the office was full of opportunities. I started staying late, chatting with Emily, the new marketing coordinator. She was younger, bright-eyed, and eager to laugh at my jokes. I told myself it was harmless. Just a little attention to remind myself I was desirable, that I could have someone else if I wanted. But it wasn't harmless. One night, Rebecca confronted me. You've been coming home later and later, she said, her voice wary. What's going on? Work's been busy, I replied casually, not meeting her eyes. She frowned. That's not all, is it? I looked at her then, my gaze steady but cold. What do you think is going on? Her face fell, the accusation hanging heavy in the air between us. I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling. But it feels like you're pulling away. Maybe I am, I said, my tone sharp. Maybe you should think about why. The look on her face should have stopped me. It was the same look she'd worn the night she confessed about Michael, an expression of guilt, regret, and heartbreak all rolled into one. But instead of feeling satisfaction, I felt empty. The next time Emily laughed at one of my jokes, her hand brushing against my arm, I didn't pull away. She asked if I wanted to grab a drink after work, and I said yes. Sitting across from her at the bar, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and guilt. She was easy to talk to, her attention flattering and undemanding. But as the evening wore on, I realized I wasn't enjoying myself. Emily wasn't Rebecca, and no amount of revenge could fill the void her betrayal had left. When I got home that night, Rebecca was waiting for me in the living room, her eyes red and puffy. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice raw. "Out," I said shortly, shrugging off my jacket. "With her?" Her question stunned me, but I quickly recovered. "Why does it matter?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Because I'm trying," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm trying to fix this, but I can't do it if you're already checked out." Her pain was palpable, and for a moment, I felt the flicker of something close to remorse. But then the anger surged again, hot and blinding. "Do you even hear yourself?" I snapped. "You don't get to play the victim here, not after what you did." Her sobs grew louder, and I turned away, unable to look at her. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. Revenge hadn't brought me the satisfaction I craved. If anything, it had deepened the chasm between us. What am I even doing? I didn't have an answer. Husband's perspective. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing myself. Every day I woke up to this suffocating tension, this gnawing pit in my stomach that only seemed to deepen with each passing moment. The more I pulled away from Rebecca, the more I detached from myself. I had started this whole thing, this dance of retribution, thinking it would make me feel better, thinking it would put me back in control. But the more I leaned into it, the more I realized that revenge wasn't as sweet as I'd imagined. It tasted bitter. It felt empty. It turned my own skin into a prison I couldn't escape. The thing about revenge is that it's never a clean break. It lingers, festers, and poisons everything it touches. Each time I dismissed Rebecca's attempts to reconnect, each time I gave Emily my attention, the walls between me and Rebecca grew taller, thicker. But something else was happening too, something I wasn't prepared for. I was suffocating. Work, I found myself unable to concentrate. Emily's laughter, once so comforting, now irritated me. I'd sit through meetings with my mind wandering, my gaze drifting to the door, wondering if I was running from the problem or just creating a new one. My thoughts would always circle back to Rebecca, her tears, her quiet apologies, the hurt that shone in her eyes when I'd shut her out. I would get home late, pretending to be tired, pretending I didn't care, but the guilt gnawed at me. What am I doing? What am I hoping to achieve? Rebecca's face was always there, no matter where I looked. It was like I could hear the weight of her silence even when she wasn't speaking. She wasn't asking for perfection. She wasn't asking for me to forgive her right away. She was asking for me to see her, to feel what she was feeling, and yet I couldn't. The distance between us grew, not just physically, but emotionally. I was doing this to punish her, to make her understand the hurt she'd caused, but all I felt was the growing ache in my chest. Every insult, every cold word, every rejection, none of it made the pain go away. It only made me realize that I had no idea how to fix us. It was late one night when I realized I couldn't keep pretending. I'd been sitting at the kitchen counter, aimlessly scrolling through my phone, when Rebecca came in, her movements slow, almost tentative. She didn't speak at first. She just stood there as though waiting for permission to exist in the same space. I felt a pang in my chest. I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the chasm between us, but I didn't know how. Then she spoke. "I'm sorry for everything." Her voice was soft, but it cut through me like glass. I turned to her, trying to keep the hurt out of my eyes. "You've already apologized 1,000 times, Rebecca. What's different now?" She stepped closer, her eyes searching mine, desperate for something, hope, maybe, or understanding. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I'm asking you to just see me, see that I'm here, trying to make it right." Her words struck me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream at her, tell her I couldn't see her anymore, that I didn't know how to. But instead, I just stood there, feeling a mixture of fury and shame that twisted in my gut. Why does it still hurt so much? I thought I wanted revenge. I thought I could make her feel the same way I did, but the truth was, I didn't know what I wanted anymore. The nights felt longer now. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the same questions over and over in my head, trying to make sense of everything, trying to find a way out of this self-imposed prison. What do I owe her? What do I owe myself? And I wondered, in the depths of the night, if the anger I had wasn't just for her, it was for myself too, for not seeing the cracks sooner, for believing that I could fix everything with retribution. One evening, after an argument that left both of us exhausted and emotionally drained, I found myself standing in front of the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, hollow, like a man who had lost something important but couldn't remember what. I could feel the weight of the decisions I'd made, each one a mark on the canvas of our marriage. And in those quiet moments of self-reflection, I knew that if I didn't find a way to stop, to release the anger that had taken root in me, I would lose everything. I was already losing it. The struggle wasn't over. The road to forgiveness, or whatever we called it now, still felt like a far-off horizon. But for the first time, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. The question was whether I could let go of my anger before it consumed us both.